Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Mark Sanders. So excited to be on this call here today to talk about tackling GDPR, an actionable approach. Today with me, this is Mark Sanders with Dell EMC. I also have Jim again from Index Engines and Mr. Jim Shook from Dell EMC as well to join me to round out this panel to provide this information to you all. Our agenda for today is going to be a quick brief overview of Dell EMC's data protection solutions and our approach to the marketplace. We're then going to follow that up with a IT perspective on GDPR. And then Mr. Jim again from Index Engines will really provide the bulk of the material that all of you have been joining for, which is, what is the workflow that will allow you to really tackle this GDPR initiative. Now, if you have questions during this session, please use the chat area within GoToMeeting to type in your questions, and we're going to get to as many of those questions at the end as we can within the hour. So, as I said, I wanted to just quickly level set with everyone around the Dell EMC data protection solutions and our strategy in this marketplace. As we see it, customers have workloads, open systems, mission critical, cloud, next gen, future. They are looking at different protection strategies against those workloads, and then they need to park that data somewhere, a protection infrastructure. They're either building, buying appliances, or they're running, SaaS-based applications for that protection storage. And really, our vision is to create this protection infrastructure as a service on top of that target, and then provide the, optimized data movers that customers need to be able to move data efficiently from those different workloads wherever they live. This includes our agent-based technology that everyone's seen and loved for a long time, our application integration, our App Direct technology, and now our Storage Direct and Hypervisor Direct technology takes customers to that next level of acceleration of data transfer, all the while giving both a self-service persona and also a managed persona, which is primarily what backup admins have been living in for a long time, and really developing this service catalog that really provides the agility and flexibility and automation that customers want across their stack. So again, you have workloads, we have the data movers you need to move them, and then we provide the build, buy, or run as a service solutions for protecting that data, making it really simple for our customers that have diverse needs across both on-prem and in the cloud to meet every protection requirement they need, both small and large. And what I mean by that is a 50 gigabyte database or a 50 terabyte database. We've got you covered with the most efficient data movers and protection storage options that you need, providing the automation where necessary and the orchestration to meet your business agility needs of today and in the future. Now, along the way, as we're protecting your workloads, we're collecting metadata, we're storing this data efficiently, and we're allowing you to really try and divine some value out of this. And, it's going to be an exciting time as Dell EMC continues to evolve our story, and we share more of that with you in the near future. Now, moving on, I wanted to just, make sure everyone understands that Dell EMC and Index Engines have been partners for quite a while. We have a 5+ year relationship. We have hundreds of mutual customers, and we've been really helping our customers' partners remediate some of the tape that they've had in their environments and remove the risk from carrying this long-term retention data on tape that's inaccessible. They may not have the third-party software that created the data originally, but yet they're challenged every day with being able to find relevant data on that old tape. And one of the key blockers to people embracing the Dell EMC data protection solution portfolio has been, hey, I have all this legacy data in a legacy tape format, and I can't get rid of my old backup software because I still need to access these old tapes. Well, this partnership with Index Engines has really allowed our customers to liberate themselves from the third-party backup software. But you know what? That's just a small piece of what Index Engines and Dell EMC can provide our customers. And there's a lot more that Index Engines can do for you, our customers, and our partners to really, get greater insight into your data. So it may be news to many of you that Index Engines really supports classification and search management of really finding that unique personal data. It's really architecting architected for huge petabyte scale and allows you to manage both your primary and your secondary data sources. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jim Shook, Director of Cybersecurity and Compliance Practice for Dell EMC's Data Protection Solutions Group, and he's going to provide you that IT perspective on what GDPR really means to you. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Mark, and that's a great introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be with you here today and looking forward to some of the questions that we're going to get, so don't forget to enter those into the chat there. So as Mark noted, in my practice, I spend a lot of time with our customers working on different issues. I've been a certified privacy professional for over 10 years, so have dealt with the Data Protection Act, which was the predecessor to GDPR, and excited about the changes and some of the interesting things that GDPR is bringing about with a lot of our customers, and of course excited to try and help out where we can. So today, we're really not a webinar specifically about all the details around GDPR. We're really focused on providing you with some actionable ideas and concepts that you can take forward in your organizations, as opposed to the details of the many articles of the GDPR. But I did want to do a quick level set on just a few things before we dive into some of those ideas. First of all, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is the newest iteration of the European Personal Data Privacy Protection Act. So there has been a Data Protection Act in the EU since the 90s, and GDPR really expands on that and makes some interesting and useful changes, as well as, and I think this is what's driving a lot of attention, introduces some pretty expensive sanctions that are potentially out there for people who don't follow and do what they're supposed to do under the GDPR. So a lot of different details to it, and we'll cover some of those today. And it does come into effect or in force May 25, 2018. I know a lot of you may be sitting out there thinking, oh my gosh, that gives us a ton of time. We don't even need to get started. And that may be the case for some of you. I'll tell you that a lot of the customers that I've spoken to over the last 6 months to a year at this point have had programs in place for 3 months, 6 months, a year, and they're worried about making the deadline because there's a lot to the reg. So definitely worth looking into, making sure that you're on track, and that date's going to come around sooner than you think. What I thought I'd start with is look at a couple of myths that we're running into. I think these are instructive, both from the standpoint that, number one, you may have heard them, and so we can kind of dispel them. And number two, some of the underlying details on why people think that these myths are true and the reasons that they're not will be useful kind of to your understanding and some of the actionable things that we're talking about as you look at your GDPR initiatives. Very prevalent one I hear all the time is we're just going to encrypt everywhere, and that's going to make us GDPR compliant. And that's a really interesting one because I've read a lot of things that make it seem that GDPR is a cybersecurity reg, which it's not. It has a small component that does discuss cybersecurity, and it's important, but it's a privacy reg. So it's really about retaining, processing, accessing data that's personal. There are requirements that say you need to reasonably secure your data if it's personal data, which makes sense. If we're going to have the privilege of holding this personal information, we need to protect it from people who would do nefarious things with it. But again, it's encryption, or really cybersecurity, is a very small component of the GDPR. You're not going to get even close to compliance by just encrypting a bunch of data. The flip side to that, I think, is we've seen many times encrypting data just here and there at the application level, at the database level, and at other locations really messes up the infrastructure, causes a lot of unintended consequences. It can break if you're doing e-discovery or e-disclosure and investigations. It makes those more difficult. Key management becomes an issue. If you have backup infrastructure, you lose a lot of your dedupe capability, so it's expensive and really doesn't buy you very much. So I'd definitely dispel that one if that's something that you're thinking about. Another myth that we run into is archive everything. And this is actually a pretty good one. We'll talk about this a bit, but archiving data is a useful tool both for compliance and regulatory purposes, as well as part of an overall GDPR strategy. You know, if you put data in an archive, you can set retention periods and control those periods. You can secure that data a little bit more readily because you know where it is, and the archive that you have may have some security controls. And searching and accessing that data, which are things you're going to have to do under the GDPR, are much more readily available and easy to do. So there's some truth to this, but by archiving, you're only going to address the certain data and data types. I run into a lot of people who have email archives, maybe file share archives. You're not going to address your structured data at all. There's a lot of log files. People have SharePoint sites that maybe aren't archived, or very large file shares that they're not going to archive everything. So you're only addressing kind of a subset of the data. And moreover, a lot of GDPR is about process. So if you think about, for example, the right to be forgotten, before IT ever gets a query to look for data that your organization holds, let's just use me as an example about Jim Shook, it's going to have to be a lot of process up front to figure out how we're going to search for Jim Shook's data, what rights he has, and things like that. So archive may be very useful, but it's not, again, it's only going to address kind of a component of the overall strategy. Then the last myth that we'll talk about here is on Privacy Shield. So for those who don't know, if you're transferring data outside of the European Union, there are some strictures on that. And in particular, if you're transferring to the US, you have to find a basis for that transfer. One of those is the Privacy Shield, which is what succeeded the Safe Harbor, which was a mechanism that allowed Europe to flow from, allowed data to flow from the EU to the US. The thing about Privacy Shield is it only addresses those cross-border transfer issues. Sometimes people forget that GDPR isn't just about transferring data, strictures on transferring data outside of the EU. It's also about retention, processing, access, things like that. So Privacy Shield could help you with the cross-border transfer component, and that's it. And then the only other concern there is, if you're looking at this pretty closely, you may be aware that the predecessor to Privacy Shield was declared invalid last year in a case that was brought by a gentleman named Max Schrems. He's introduced a similar case against Privacy Shield that's pending now, and it's certainly possible that Privacy Shield might also be declared invalid. So if you're relying on that, you may want to have a backup plan at some point, or just be thinking about that. So those are three myths that we generally see out there, and hopefully useful information for you as you think about the GDPR. What I want to do here is, and let me be clear about what we're talking with here. This is a very data-focused view, or IT-focused view, if you will, of some of the GDPR capabilities that we see our customers considering as part of their overall program. So this isn't going to be a complete GDPR program. These are going to be the kinds of projects and capabilities that the IT team at all levels might need to deliver to make sure that the organization's GDPR program is complete. So these may be projects you're already undertaking. These may be things that the organization will be coming to you later. But I wanted to cover those briefly, and then we'll lead into Jim McGann from Index Engines, really going into a lot of depth on an actionable approach on unstructured data, which is an area that is quite difficult to get your arms around for various reasons. So if you look at this diagram, across that next to the bottom block, those are capabilities that most organizations will have to deliver as part of their GDPR compliance. So let's look at the first three, and then we'll look at some of the projects that IT may need to put together to help deliver those capabilities. Those first three, so data use, consent, minimization, GDPR really limits your ability to retain data for the purpose for which it was collected, and you need a reason to retain it, or there needs to be a requirement to retain that data. Otherwise, you need to get rid of it. And of course, if you are relying on consent and that consent is withdrawn, then you're going to have to get rid of that data too. Right of access, somebody can come to you and say, well, I say somebody, really, an EU citizen or resident can come to you and say, I would like a copy, or I'd like to know all of the data that you hold about me. And so, you think about that. What's the workflow around that, and what does IT need to do to make that happen? And then finally, the right of deletion or the right to be forgotten. Under certain circumstances, people can request that your organization delete the data that you hold about them if there's no valid basis for retaining that data and they've withdrawn their consent to it. So those are three pretty difficult things to do. And in this last row, we'll talk briefly about how IT may help with that. So one of the things, the second box there, audited retention and deletion, if you're going to minimize data and make sure that you're retaining appropriately, then you need to get rid of data. So if you're holding email forever, if you're holding content and file shares forever, really need to look at that and set up some retention periods that are more appropriate. And IT really should not be responsible for determining the retention period. That's a legal or compliance or privacy concern, or perhaps even the business. But IT will typically be responsible for ensuring that the tools are in place and that there's some kind of audit log or other trail that you'll need to prove and establish what you've been doing all along. Search and access are two other key components too. If you think about right of access or right to be forgotten, you actually have to locate the data. So again, using me as an example, if I come to your organization and say, give me a copy of all the data you have about me, how are you going to do that search? Under GDPR, some of the personal data might be obviously my name. You might have a customer or client ID. In GDPR, it could be an email address. It could even be an IP address. So if the business does come to IT, they're going to need to help IT understand, here's how we need to do those searches, but IT is going to be responsible for actually conducting the searches. Another big one, tape deletion and migration. So if you have decades or even 7, 8 years worth of data on tape, how are you going to access that information to meet the right of access or the right to be forgotten? And even, let's be clear here, GDPR does not say necessarily that you have to go to tape. It's silent on the issue. There are some principles of proportionality and reasonableness. Some people have conjectured that perhaps you don't have to search your tapes for that type of data, but we haven't heard anything from the working party and there's nothing in the regs. So it's a risk point that a lot of organizations have to think about. I think it's evident that if you have 6 months worth of data, you're at less risk than if you have 20 years worth of data, if that data is personal. But those are projects that IT might be called upon to review that tape and land it somewhere where it can be easier searched, more readily searched, and perhaps deleted. And then finally, mapping and file intelligence. Data mapping, workflow mapping, the business needs to understand where all the data is located. This is triggered for determining whether it is EU personal data that's under the GDPR, whether there's cross-border transfers that need to be looked at, things like that. So even high-level mapping, and then as Jim's going to get into with file intelligence, getting some detail around the content that's out there so you can make decisions on it is really critical. The last two things I'll touch on here very briefly, cross-border transfers. So we've mentioned that if the data leaves the EU, there needs to be some type of a basis for it. Privacy Shield, if it's coming to the US, is one way. You can also look at model clauses, model contracts, and BCRs, binding corporate rules, are a couple of bases. We've seen customers think about other things, such as let's keep the data in the union now. So maybe setting up a new data center or adding some capabilities to the data center within the EU so they don't have to pull that data back across the US. Those are ideas. Private clouds located in the EU, or even private clouds that are located there. And we have a lot of tools and capabilities that we'll touch on at the end that you can use from Dell EMC that will help you there. And then finally, with security, as I said before, it's not the overarching part of GDPR that you need to worry about, but there are security components and data security too, making sure that data is reasonably secured. IT is going to probably be responsible for kind of enlightening the business on what's being done to protect data, detect breaches, and there is a 72-hour breach notification requirement under the GDPR that, reviewing your incident response plan and the other capabilities that you have out there for those requirements is going to be pretty important. So hopefully that gives you a good kind of data overview perspective of some of the GDPR initiatives that you may have to help the business with as part of the overall GDPR initiatives that they have. So before I hand it over to Jim, I just want to say a few words about unstructured content. This has been an area of real concern for our customers in GDPR. Many of them have databases, structured data, that it's a lot of data and it's a lot of work, but they feel confident that they can access it in the ways that they need to. The exact opposite with unstructured content. And unstructured, I'm really talking about data that's in file shares, perhaps even laptops and desktops, kind of user-generated productivity content, maybe some log files and things like that. And the challenges there, often large data sets, petabytes. So it's difficult to get any kind of a handle on what's out there. Little insight into content. Is it personal data? There's a lot of this information out here. We don't know whether it's going to be under the scope of GDPR or not. A lot of it is probably expired. I have people I've spoken with who have petabytes of data, and the file share's been around for 10 years or 12 years, and a lot of the people who wrote data to it are gone. Departments have moved, and the data's been left behind. So those are issues that need to be looked at. And so gaining some insight, some knowledge on that data to really start the process of doing some level of classification is really important. How old are these files? What types of files do we have here? Those will give you some clues to whether they might be triggered under the GDPR, whether you can get rid of them or not, issues like that. And then even the locations and paths sometimes give you some clues. If data is in an HR path or a legal path, we might have some information we can glean from just that. But it's a really big challenge and a difficult one. And Jim and the people at Index Engines have some tools and some processes that can really help you along. And with that, I want to hand it over to you, Jim McGann.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. There's a lot there. There's a lot of challenges that customers are facing. At Index Engines, we are a software provider aimed at really providing intelligence and more manageable workflows in support of policy, specifically things like GDPR, other privacy policies. The challenge that we're seeing, and when we talk to customers, we hear this every day, is it's really, GDPR puts really the personal data back in the hands of citizens and customers. So it's really a fundamental change in how we manage information. And what we're going to do today is really more present an intelligent workflow based on the Index Engine software on how to make your GDPR policies and efforts to manage data just more effective and more manageable. So what we're doing really is bucketing or creating 3 different components to the workflow. The first component is really understanding or classifying data so you can categorize it and understand what exists. Customers that we talk to frequently have no detailed understanding, as Jim mentioned earlier, understanding of what exists on the network. The files they created yesterday, sure, they know where they are. I mean, sometimes, something I created last week, I can't find it on my desktop. But stuff they created 4, 5 years, 10 years ago, stuff that's migrated from primary storage to backup tape archives, what exists there? How do you categorize it? And the challenge that every organization has is you could have petabytes, multiple petabytes of content. So this is a petabyte scale problem that no one's ever tackled. So we have developed technology to allow you to understand at a petabyte level what you have so you can categorize it. So categorizing it is into a number of different buckets, which we will talk about. The main bucket is in-scope data. So in-scope data is based on the GDPR regulations. As Jim mentioned earlier, what is that content? Whether it be, identifiers, whether it be email addresses, IP addresses. So finding content that could be in scope. So specific users, specific organizations, types of files, what would you define in your organization as in scope for the GDPR? To be able to search across that content and not only search it at a very high level, keyword search or using Boolean search or some of the basic search, but to go deep and look in conceptual search capabilities that we'll talk about. And finally, managing the content, getting it where it needs to be, if it needs to exist at all. Is there stuff that could be purged from the network? Is there content that could be moved to a secure cloud archive and managed there so it's much more in control? Stuff that needs to be managed in place on the network. So this defensible disposition strategy. So if you break it down into 3 steps, know what you have and categorize it. Find that target data, that in-scope content that would be really highly suspect to contain personal or private data. And then to develop an integrated disposition strategy to get it where it needs to be in order to manage it much more effectively. So we look at classifying content, and every organization may have different types of classification. These are some of the common ones, or very high-level classification buckets that we see out there. So rot data, or redundant, obsolete, and trivial data, is kind of a classic records management or information management term that's been floating out there for many years. What is rot? It's the data that really has no business value any longer. So we see rot could be upwards of 40% of data that could exist on the network. So is it related to the GDPR? Not specifically, but we talk about data minimization, as Jim mentioned, as cleaning up the content and cleaning up your data center and your servers that exist out there would really help facilitate the policy management for any kind of privacy policies. So it kind of cleans it out, gets data out of the way. A lot of organizations could purge this from their network. A lot are looking at just migrating it to, say, for example, the Dell EMC cloud, really to simplify the management process. You know, it's data that's off, unstructured data that's off the network, but in a secure, index, searchable repository that can be managed very, very easily. And the advantage there is you would really minimize your data footprint and make the the classification process much easier. The second bucket is out-of-scope data, which could be a significant portion. So it could be users that would never really deal with personal content. It could be types of files that would not contain personal data. It's really the obvious stuff based on your expertise of your organization that really could be moved out of scope and eliminated from the GDPR queries. So if you do have multiple petabyte environment, why would you want to be querying that content and searching for that content for personal data every time you receive a request when you don't need to? It's really not necessary. So let's get that out of scope data. Not to say that we're moving it or getting it off the network, leave it in place, but eliminate it from GDPR queries and GDPR requests. And finally, you get that in-scope data. So every organization may have different statistics here. We see about 10% of the content that could exist on the network would be in-scope data. That's the stuff where your personal and private data would typically exist. So within your HR department or your finance or legal department, people that deal with personal data on a daily basis, those would be in scope. So it's a more manageable subset of all your data assets. That's really your focal point for GDPR queries. So this process is core to the Index Engine's platform to be able to analyze data at a high level metadata and look at the content. So when we talk about metadata indexing, we capture that file level metadata like file name, the path, the owner, file size, when was it accessed, ACLs. So those are the access logs, who has read, write, browse permission, very important for privacy and security audits and more. So looking at those metadata fields, you can really generate very powerful reports to be able to classify the content. And a lot of organizations that have really relied on a traditional data mapping approach. So data mapping is more of an interview-based analysis of the data center. What type of data was contained on these email servers, versions of emails, things like that that are historical and factual based. Very difficult to execute data mapping based on interviews when the game has changed. People who were responsible for things like email servers or file servers are no longer with the organization or onto different responsibilities. Looking back and trying to figure out the environment, what it looked like 10 years ago is really a difficult process. But data mapping does have value. We see this, the Index Engine's metadata indexing solution as a complement, a significant complement to the data mapping process, where you can take this metadata, the reports, the analysis, figure out who owns what data by users, by department, frequency of data access, where's the active data versus the inactive data, types of files, are they Excel spreadsheets that would have customer information, or are they PowerPoints created by the marketing department that are just non-personal content, location of this content, volume of data by capacity and server. So the factual-based information based on metadata indexing. Very powerful, very useful to support data mapping and profiling efforts. So this is really where the power of the index engine platform come in. We provide very high-speed crawling of these data sources. So as Jim mentioned, unstructured data is something that is really going to be key to supporting the GDPR and those privacy policies. But being able to do this across petabyte environments is really where index engines excels. So providing the high-speed crawling of these email servers, file servers, SharePoint servers, wherever data lies. Jim mentioned earlier backup data. Is backup data part of the GDPR? It's not specifically called out in the GDPR, but it's not eliminated from the policy or the regulation. So I would take a chance right now to take the opportunity to clean this up. Otherwise, as Jim mentioned, it's very high risk to leave that data around. Because if you're going to satisfy a customer's or a citizen's need for eliminating or deletion of personal data, if it still exists on your backup tape archives, that's a high-risk situation. So Index Engines has some unique ability to do metadata level indexing across backup data using the backup catalog. So these queries that are developed or these policies developed on the unstructured data on primary storage could be applied to your secondary or backup data copies as well very easily. So we provide industry-leading indexing speeds reaching 8,000 files per second per node. It is the highest speed indexing platform on the market today to be able to provide this very comprehensive view into unstructured data as well that exists on primary storage as well as secondary or backup storage. Very efficient, very designed to be petabyte class to search large volumes of data. We have customers that have deployed this globally. It's a federated environment that can search multiple locations, very scalable for large scale environments, so petabyte class environments. So let's look at some of the reports. These are some reports coming out of the Index Engines platform. Earlier we talked about things like rot analysis or age data. Let's look at things like where is the redundant or duplicate files exist, what data has been accessed over the past, within the past 3 years by different groups. Index Engines integrates to Active Directory, so you can do queries saying, show me members of these groups like marketing or operations or sales. You can look at data owned by ex-employees. Show me all data owned on the network by people that are not active members in the Active Directory group, for example. Modification times, what was last modified? Where's the active data exist? Finding trivial files, things like vacation photos or movies, there were iTunes libraries that exist on the network. That should be cleaned up and removed. That takes up significant just capacity on the network that's going to get in the way of any kind of GDPR requests. And then active files. So there's very dynamic, very customizable reports that could be created. This is a sample of a dashboard. Your dashboard can be customized based on your environment, something you can look at every day. There's a lot of other things like automation that can be built in, which we'll talk about a little bit further down the road. But the idea is to get a view and understanding of what exists on the network so you can execute these policies. So what are the key challenges? And when we talk to clients about personal data, the definition is very vague, a little bit confusing. It's going to be changing and evolving. So it's going to be very challenging for organizations to find all personal data. It's not something you can do a simple keyword search or a simple basic search to find. It's going to be very challenging to find all personal data that exists out there. So finding it, which could include, a name, which is fairly easy, health information, more complex. So it's going to be based on an organization's understanding of the type of data they create and to build search and queries that would support this. So this gets deeper into the Index Engines platform, which talks about the deep indexing. So metadata indexing is fine for a high-level view, high-level classification, to organize data, to really figure out what exists and to put it into these, out of scope, in scope buckets. The deep indexing goes inside the content. So the idea is the first phase of this workflow is you've created an in-scope repository or an in-scope classified set of data. So now we want to go deep into that in-scope data. Typically, again, a small subset, let's assume around 10% of your data assets. So index engines can do a much deeper index the content that exists there. It's a very, again, high-speed indexing, about terabyte per hour per node, again, federated. So we can support queries across multiple environments. We have customers that have data centers located in multiple continents, multiple countries. So we can query across all those environments and provide a petabyte class search and query. Again, it's supporting network data and legacy backup data assets. So if you do have petabytes or decades worth of data on legacy tape archives or legacy backup archives, you can apply these same queries that you've developed across the network to these legacy data assets. So as you're cleaning up your primary storage, you should really be attacking your secondary or backup archives as well. There's no reason to keep that content around. So the search aspect to the Index Engines platform is critical to providing a solution that can find everything. So we have a number of different search capabilities in the solution. Keyword search is very common. A lot of solutions have that and are only limited to keyword search. So finding search strings such as name, addresses, tax IDs, things like that, those are all customizable. Those are all can be built into the Index Engines query platform, stored, run on a regular basis, and find data at a very high speed, very quick approach. Very common to have keyword search. Pattern search, looking for patterns, things like bank routing numbers, social security numbers, credit card numbers. We are building extensive patterns to support all countries globally. Very important that these patterns exist. So as we index the data, we'll make those patterns quickly searchable so you can find that type of content just by typing in the patterns and finding the result set. It's very easy. So it'll support many different types of patterns that exist, like bank accounting numbers and then other types of identification numbers that exist in different countries. The most important piece that we've added is concept search or conceptual search. So this is based on looking for personal data that doesn't fall into the above categories. It's really using machine learning algorithms that you could train the Index Engines platform to say, these are types of documents that will contain personal and private data. So once the Index Engine platform learns that, it automatically develops these sophisticated queries that could be applied across large data sets and find that content easily. So with this combination of these different search algorithms, search options, you'll provide extensive ability to search across large volumes of data with considerable precision. And this is a unique ability into the Index Engines platform that will allow organizations to find everything across that in-scope data set. So now let's talk about disposition. So disposition of the data assets. So once you understand what exists, you've got your queries built and you can really manage and find content and organize it very easily. So let's go back to that pyramid that kind of showed the different data buckets that we talked about earlier. So the first bucket being ROT, the redundant, obsolete, trivial content. So most organizations really don't want to delete that content. If you can, that's great. What a lot of organizations are doing is leveraging things like the Dell EMC cloud, whether it be ECS or VirtuStream, and being able to migrate and move that data offline into a cloud environment and store it there. So the value of the Index Engine solution is it'll move that data into the cloud, into object storage, and maintain an index searchable capability across that content. So if you do need to search it to find that content in the future, there may be some valuable intellectual property in there, or there may be content that you may want to retrieve. It's indexed and searchable, and you can get access to it. But moving it off into lower cost storage that's secure and off-premise has significant value. The interesting aspect, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, is we have talked to organizations that have not really budgeted sufficiently to support their GDPR efforts to implement technology in support of the GDPR. So doing this ROT analysis, ROT cleanup, will deliver significant return on investment and funding to help prepare for the GDPR. So in the next slide, you'll see a little bit more detail on that. But maintaining all this aged, outdated data on your primary storage network, backing it up, managing it, and so on is expensive. So by reducing this expense significantly, this could provide funding to support technology for the GDPR requirements. More to come on that. The out-of-scope data, so ignore this for now. It's data that's active on the network. Users see value in it. It may be actively being used, or it may have value down the road. But let's ignore this for now in terms of GDPR queries, GDPR requests. We've basically made a decision based on the classification exercise we went through earlier, is that data is out of scope. I don't need to look at that to find personal or private data. So let's ignore it for now. You may want to monitor the data in place for future changes and requirements. For example, maybe the GDPR requirements change a year or two from now, and some of that out-of-scope data becomes in scope. That's easily modifiable. It's just a modification of your GDPR policies within the index engine, and you can move some of that out-of-scope data in scope. So the final bucket is the in-scope content. That is the core data that we care about for this regulation, and you need to manage that based on policies. So monitoring the data in place, migrating the data that can be migrated, archiving what could be archiving. Every organization we talk to has different strategies here, and that's something that can be done across a more manageable data set, as we mentioned. So ROT cleanup, talk about that one more time, about the ROI here. So again, minimizing, and we hear a lot today about data minimization, is minimizing your data assets, cleaning up this content, the redundant, obsolete, trivial data, is something that can be done easily as you're going through a classification process. So classifying it, knowing this data exists out there. Most of this data could disappear off the primary network, and your users wouldn't even know that it disappeared, that it didn't exist any longer. So the benefit of this from an IT organization perspective is that we see this creating a compelling ROI, a return on investment. So it'll be taking budgets that's being used to manage this aged, obsolete data that has no business value, and applying it to more productive capabilities such as this policy and privacy data management. One, it reduces your primary storage footprint, and ongoing upgrades that exist on the network. It'll reduce your data center infrastructure. One of the interesting things we see is we dealt with an organization that was managing multiple petabytes on the primary storage. They were able to reduce that footprint by 40%, which allows them to free up capacity. But they were also able to reduce their backup software environment, or their backup window, and reduce their data protection costs because they reduce significant volume of data on primary storage. Kind of a hidden cost and a hidden benefit by performing ROT cleanup. And then eliminating risk and exposure of this really unknown legacy content. It's really data that, as we know, is really unmanaged or unknown. So eliminating the risk, or getting it off primary storage and keeping it in a secure indexed archive, so that your business users that own that data could look at it and say, does this data have any risk or exposure for down the road? So most organizations, and again, it depends on the type of organization, can realize up to a 40% return on investment here for this ROT cleanup exercise. And if you start looking at the cost of storage, and you can ask 10 different people what it costs for a petabyte of storage, and you'll probably get 10 different answers. So I put up two different examples. One, Forrester Research, who is a industry research firm. IBM talks about this frequently. Anywhere from a couple $1 million to $4 million. I've heard $1 million per petabyte of storage. If you were able to move that data from primary storage to something like Dell EMC cloud storage, like ECS, or their VirtuStream cloud storage, there a petabyte of cloud storage could be $360,000 a year, significantly less than millions of dollars as they cite. And the benefits there are reduced data center infrastructure, reduced cost of storage and upgrades. And the cost there is $360,000 per petabyte, could be significantly less depending on different strategies that Dell EMC offers. So we're happy to talk to you further about these kind of cleanup exercises. I think one of the interesting things that the GDPR is really introducing as a concept is we just can't let data exist the way it did in the past, just letting it lie around on the network, unmanaged and growing year by year. We need to start taking control of this content and managing it in a much more intelligent approach. So back to the index engine solution, some of the migration and archiving features that exist is the ability to migrate data to new repositories. Index Engines has a legacy data archiving or an archiving component to the solution that takes advantage of object storage, again, like the Dell EMC Cloud, to be able to migrate data from primary storage to an index searchable repository in object storage, which saves significant resources, moves the data, from an on-prem environment, on-premise environment to off-prem environment that is much more cost-effective to manage. Again, deletion of data with no business value. There's a defensible deletion process built into the Index Engines platform, and then integrated archiving, migration and archiving solutions within the platform. The key advantage of the Index Engines product is that it's fully integrated. So as you build these policies, build these classifications, and define these different buckets of content, you could easily just execute disposition strategies within the platform in a very quick and easy approach. It's a very defensible process. The important aspect of it, all the migrations are logged, so there's an audit trail. Within the GDPR, there's the concept of the data protection officer, or the DPO. It's very important that the DPO has these tools to create an auditable and defensible process that they can review if they are going through a GDPR audit in the future. All the metadata remains intact as data is migrated. Very important. You don't want to use migration tools that are going to strip out owners and strip out access times or modified times or any of that, because that really corrupts the content. So lots of migration tools built in. And finally, there's a number of security features. So some of the things that Jim mentioned earlier is the GDPR requires some of the security aspects to, really managing things like data breaches that are in the news every day of every week, it seems. But the GDPR really mandates strict notifications and potential fines for data breaches and attacks on personal data. So right now we're going through, a major data breach through an organization in the U.S. It's a global organization that manages personal content. If the GDPR was in place, it would be radically different as to how they are approaching the response to this data breach. So it's something that's going to help citizens and support citizens' privacy and management of this content. And it's going to be very challenging for organizations. So we have developed capabilities to help organizations obviously find it and manage this personal data, which I've been talking about this morning, but looking at activity logs. Who has access to personal data? So if you find sensitive content that exists, maybe spreadsheets from the legal department that contains very personal and private data for their customers and for citizens, you can look and see who has access to this. So it's very common that users on the network that may potentially be bad actors or rogue employees may have access to this sensitive content. So these audit tools are available to look at these activity logs and determine who has access to it through read-write browse permission, through the ACLs or access control logs, or look at the activity logs and say, who has access to this? So if you find a specific user that has been accessing very sensitive data on a frequent basis, you potentially have a rogue employee that could actually be causing some data breach out on the network or on sensitive data. So to be able to proactively clean up this content, perform security audits before any of this content breaches the firewall. And I know there's a lot of other security features that we have in the product, especially to support things like ransomware and support things like any kind of access to this content or sensitive access. So there's a lot of other tools this goes very deep. I know Dell EMC and Index Engines both offer lots of solutions here. So this is lightly touching on that. So very important capability. So with that, I mean, we only had, a few minutes this morning to really talk about this, but in a nutshell, Dell EMC and Index Engines have partnered to provide solutions to be able to manage content at very high levels and at very detailed levels to be able to support the EU General Data Protection Regulation and help customers get their data centers in order. So with that, I wanted to pass it back to Jim Shook, who is going to talk a little bit more about some of the Dell EMC products that support the GDPR.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. That was great. And I'll go through this quickly because I know we want to save a little bit of time here for questions. We touched on some of this. So if you have our solutions in place today, Data Domain, Source One, the VirtuStream Cloud or Data Protection Suite, we have a lot of different capabilities that will help you with GDPR. So the ability to search through that data, to set retention periods. As I mentioned before, with the clouds, VirtuStream can geographically restrict the cloud inside the EU or outside, whatever's going to help you there. If you want to go with the private cloud, on-premise, ECS, all kinds of different tools to let you get that work done. DP Search lets you search through your backups to find data that might be relevant. And just to touch briefly on Source One, I'd mentioned before about archives. If you have that in place or need something like that, the ability to archive data, set retention periods on it that will be controlled, and then do quick searches and pulling that data for right of access or deleting it for right to be forgotten are all key components of that process. So again, if you're an existing customer today, we have those capabilities that you need to get through the process. And if you need to look at some of what we have, we'd be happy to talk to you about how we can help.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And so that wraps it up for today. If you do have some questions, feel free to type them into the question box you'll see on the right side. You can also contact us. I have Jim Shook's email address on the screen today, as well as the Index Engines email address on the screen. We do have a Dell EMC paper that exists, and we're happy to send that to you. Index Engines also has a playbook that goes into much more detail about what we talked about today. Just send us a request for either a copy of the slides or a copy of this playbook or this information. Today's session is also recorded, so we have a recording available that you can share with your colleagues. We also are talking to customers about GDPR readiness and assessments and some of the things that both Dell EMC and Index Engines can deliver to help get ready for next year in support of this new regulation and to help organizations start implementing these policy-based information management environments. So again, if you do have questions, feel free to send them one-on-one. We have a couple of questions that have come in. I mean, one of the questions, this is a long question, Jim, this is probably for you, that I'll just try to summarize here, but they're talking about we have multiple offices, multiple locations. We haven't really implemented a cloud strategy. Is there solutions that can be provided through Dell EMC or Index Engines to help us here?
Wow, that's a big one, Jim. Really separate this into two pieces. So one is kind of the whole GDPR strategy initiative. It's a complex regulation. You're going to need legal compliance and privacy help to figure out what compliance needs to be put into place. So there's workflows, there's data that needs to be reviewed. Are you really subject to GDPR? What data is subject? And not everything in GDPR is clear, so organizations have to decide how much risk they want to take on with GDPR. A good example being, as we said before, a little uncertainty around tape. If you're very conservative, you would do something with it, and if you want to take the risk, you might ignore it completely. So those are decisions that have to be made at a business and organizational level. As far as the capabilities that we have and Index Engines have, as you start to undertake the projects that are going to get you to compliance with the initiative that you've put together, we have a lot that can help you there, some of which we've outlined today. So if you're an existing customer, if you want to talk more, our account teams would be happy to talk to you. I'd be happy to you send me an email, I'll get back to you and provide you with a little bit more detail there. But it's not something, you can't go buy a solution or a couple of solutions and say that we're now GDPR compliant. It just is not going to work that way at all.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jim, on that. And Index Engines also has representatives in EMEA that can help with this solution and provide, we deal frequently with customers that have multiple locations and multiple environments and support, migrating data to the cloud. I mean, there's lots of different strategies here. Another question is about backup tapes. Confused about backup tapes. How do we manage that content? I think Index Engine is one of the unique abilities, and we didn't spend a lot of time talking about it today, is that we have direct indexing of those backup tapes or backup catalogs to be able to profile and classify that content and migrate it off of tape. We don't feel that tape makes a good long-term retention archive, and we have customers that are migrating that content to a cloud repository and eliminating their tape infrastructure. And a lot of the solutions that we see that we've partnered up with Dell EMC is they have a lot of solutions allowing customers to go tapeless and stop using tape as an archive. And I think there's some stuff that, I don't know if you want to mention some of the stuff you have, Jim, that allows customers to really leverage the cloud and stop creating tapes for long-term retention.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good reasons to not have tape for long-term retention, including the GDPR, but there are other reasons too, operationally, the expense of the infrastructure, the treasure trove of data for e-discovery investigations, all kinds of different things. So again, it's something you really need to look into. I think there's risk there under GDPR. We expect some more guidance from the working group on exactly what's in play for there. I don't know when that will come. So, it's kind of a risk point there. I think, Jim, organizations that are very conservative and worried about that risk will consider getting rid of their tape, indexing it, and getting rid of what's old and landing the rest on either cloud storage or some form of spinning disk that they can access it very quickly. Certainly no mandate there, but takes away kind of that risk point if that's of concern.
Thanks, Jim. Well, I'm told we're out of time here. So if you do have any others that you'd like to get briefed on this presentation, we are actually meeting with a lot of organizations and they're bringing in their data protection officers or those teams. We're happy to meet and provide further guidance on some of these solutions that you learned about today. Again, if you do have any other questions, our email addresses are there. Reach out to us. We're happy to provide you with content and follow-up sessions to help you get aligned with your GDPR strategies. Again, we recorded this. I'm happy to share it with others. Just reach out to us. But again, thank you for your time today. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Mark, for your time today as well. I think it was very valuable information.
Yes, thanks everyone, and thanks to you, Jim, and Index Engines. Appreciate it.